my dears, I cannot express how much of a journey this video has been to make, and it really just didn't need to be. That was so very unnecessary. The initial plan was that I was going to do a different video for the first weekend of the new year. It was going to be great, but then I could feel myself descending into autistic burnout because the combination of work and the holidays, all that hitting at once was a lot. So I decided it's a better idea if I just take a week off, and then the next week I'll ignore my schedule altogether and instead make a video about whatever is interesting me at the time, because part of burnout, which we'll discuss shortly, is like motivation gets really wacky. So I was like, I'll just research whatever brings me joy, which ended up beginning to write this video because all I could think about was burnout. But then turns out half the reason that my burnout was weirdly severe for how well I thought I was taking care of myself is because I was getting really, really sick, which then absolutely took me out, resulting in the chaos of last week's video that you can watch up here if you want. I'm weirdly proud of it for how much I don't remember writing or filming it. But now we're here, we're finally making this video, and the next week I'll get back on track with a video that I will now have been working on for over a month, about a month by the time it finally comes out. I'm really stoked about it. I'm really excited, so stay tuned. The other part of this video's way too long journey is that I've actually made a video on autistic burnout before. Back in the era when my scripts were a maximum length of maybe 4 pages, now we average about 12 to 13. I also used to use she, her pronouns at the time, and I didn't appear to cite any of my sources. I know that I researched stuff back then because I remember doing it, but having no sort, that's very academically suspicious of me. So I decided, why not make another more thorough video on autistic burnout, and I think I will probably take that one down, or I don't know, because I probably linked it from a lot of other videos, so I might just link this video in the description of that one to like lead people to this one instead. That might be the move. Anyway, it's nice to know how much I've grown in the last 3 years, right? Like we love when people grow and learn and get better at their careers. It's wonderful. I do feel like maybe this wasn't the video to talk about how I didn't cite my sources in that one, and therefore I wanted to update the video for that reason, because I don't really have sources for this one either. It's mostly personal lived experience, but I will at least be more thorough with this version, and it will also include some solution options rather than just like, wow, this sucks, because that's what the last one did. That I can promise you. Also, light content heads up, we will be discussing some aspects of like behaviors I wouldn't directly describe as hurting oneself, but maybe behaviors that aren't the most helpful or healthy or thought through or safe, because burnout and depression often come hand in hand. But as always, I will talk about them as little as I possibly can to get my point across, and in this case it will be somewhat solution focused anyway, so yeah. Now, burnout as a concept is kind of a buzzword. We hear it all the time from employers being like, learning a proper work-life balance is important for preventing burnout and that kind of stuff. That burnout is occupational burnout, where over time the pressures of work become super overwhelming to the point where it causes exhaustion, mental distance from the job, and reduced productivity. And also in the ICD-11 as an occupational phenomenon that could influence health status, but not as a disorder. And it says, burnout refers specifically to phenomena in the occupational context and should not be applied to describe experiences in other areas of life, specifically saying that it is caused by chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Which sounds a little victim blamey if I'm being real about it, but sure, whatever, we'll work with it. Now, autistic burnout is kind of similar to that, but rather than being exhausted by the pressures of work, we become exhausted by the pressures of being a person in a deeply overwhelming and inaccessible and fundamentally unsafe world that is not built for us, caused by being frequently placed in stressful situations without adequate time to recover. Most autistic adults I know can tell you exactly when their major burnout periods in their lives were. Mine were 2nd grade, 10th grade, first year of college, junior year of college, and then last spring. The first year of college one's a little complicated because that was combined with an actual medical situation. But yeah, I have a tattoo for each one. That's what my stars are, if you're wondering, so I don't forget. But after my first year of college, when everything fell apart, I was able to figure out how to manage my work-rest balance. So I'm always paying attention to energy levels and can usually prevent a burnout before it starts at this point, unless something super catastrophically stressful happens, usually as a result of extreme discrimination with no possible way of getting out or getting support, which was the case for my last 2. Burnout can look like many things, most of them centering around general dysregulation and having a hard time re-regulating. I made a list that's kind of a combination of lists I've seen online and my own lived experience. I'm gonna start with the first 3 things that tipped me off to the fact that I might be burnt out this time around, and then I'll talk about other things that also exist. So my first red flag that I needed to maybe take a break is the speed at which I fell into a new special interest. I have a tendency to consume media that I don't particularly like, and then once I start researching it for something, usually a video, but also other academic stuff, I slowly become more interested in it and I like it. But otherwise, if I don't like something at first, I usually continue to not like it, and that does not change. I'm not somebody who slowly likes things over time unless I've put a significant amount of time into it or I associate it with somebody that I care about. So the fact that I saw a thing, I'm not going to say what it is, but the fact that I saw a thing, didn't love it, didn't really like it, to be honest, and then couldn't stop thinking about it to a truly bothersome degree that I was getting songs from the soundtrack in my head that were keeping me up at night. Like, I literally could not fall asleep, and I couldn't stop thinking about the thing that, again, I didn't like. I straight up did not like it, but I couldn't get out of my brain. Yeah, in general, I know that my earworms, i.e. like things that get stuck in your head, which can be songs and also just like random phrases, get a lot worse when I'm burnt out. So that itself was already something that made me think, maybe I'm getting a little dysregulated. But the fact that my brain could not let go of a media that I didn't like because it was looking for comfort in literally any direction was a big clue for me that maybe I needed to slow down and reassess how I was doing. The other thing that is usually a red flag for me is when I start second guessing every single social interaction that I have to a concerning and unhealthy degree. Like, I'm used to being socially anxious, but to this point, like, I will have a really great call with somebody, and then a little while after it's over, I start to second guess every single little thing that I said, and then I start to feel weird about it, and then I feel like maybe I should apologize for being weird, and then I start to convince myself with literally no concrete proof that actually the interaction didn't go well, and that person hates me, and everything is bad, and I should do them a favor and never speak to them again. And it's just like a general, like, my brain starts to feel a little squirrely. It starts to think not super clearly, and I feel like I can't totally be trusted, so maybe I should just avoid people until I feel a little bit more like what I say can be trusted and like I feel confident as a person being. As a human being. And also, I will get really mad at people for no reason just because I'm tired, and so I just get mad at them. Overall, my self-control gets pretty wonky. I know that in my brain, maybe what I'm doing isn't the best thing to do. Like, I'm aware of it, but I do it anyway because I just don't have the energy to stop myself. Usually on a small scale, like, maybe I shouldn't try to do two things at once. Not like, major concerning life-threatening things. But when I feel this way, I will often give myself a no-post rule on social media unless it's like something pre-scheduled until I feel a bit more clear-headed. That's a rule that I've put in place for myself so that I can be more responsible. Not that anything has really happened in the past, I don't think, but I get nervous that it will, and then I'll be too tired to handle it if something bad happens, so then that will just make it worse, so I just don't. Frankly, I think that there are some folks on various social media platforms who could personally use that rule for themselves. It would save their careers, but you know what, whatever. The third thing is I have PTSD, and my flashbacks usually get significantly worse around the holidays anyway, because the holidays are a yearly reminder of lots of things. My brain doesn't like that, but even well after the holidays, I was having the teeniest, tiniest things trigger major flashbacks that were taking me out of my day-to-day in a way that is very atypical for me, unless I've like stayed up until 2 a.m. watching a sad and triggering movie. In general, it takes a lot of exhaustion and often a very visible direct connection to a thing to trigger those in me the vast majority of the time. But I literally had a moment where I was walking outside and my brain was like, it is cold. Here is another memory of when you were cold that you've completely forgotten about until now that is now making you cry while you're walking down the streets of New York City. And that was the only like remotely tangential connection between why that was the memory it triggered. And I was like, wow, I need to pause and recuperate a bit because this is not sustainable for like living my life as a person. So those are the major things that are clearly out of the blue for me in ways I most clearly recognize, because those are things I've learned to be aware of since they've caused me to make really poor choices in the past. And now I'm hypervigilant about them. So they're like, oh, these things are happening. That's a clue that I need to chill. There's also lots of other smaller burnout things that I usually don't notice until I start looking for them. Burnout usually comes with a lot of regression or losing skills. So for example, I've done extensive therapy around learning various coping skills for when I'm very overwhelmed. But when I'm burnt out, I will often do the more harmful, painful coping mechanisms I used to do when I was a lot younger and don't do anymore because I've learned different skills. Harmful in like a literal and in a mental way, such as like stims that literally hurt my body, or catastrophizing to the point where I decide that dropping a bobby pin on the ground means that everything's terrible forever and it will never change or get any better. Much like how I handle social interactions with burnt out, actually. Same situation. I also tend to struggle a lot more with organic speech production and putting words together, and I become a much pickier eater because I'm a lot more sensitive to the textures of foods. I typically need to stim a lot more. I'm much more sensory sensitive. I have a hard time masking my facial expressions. This is when a lot of my friends discover that I have tics, because my body rarely does them in general. It only does them when I'm really, really exhausted or really, really stressed. My interoception issues get worse, which means like knowing what's going on inside of you. So I will like have a hard time noticing when I'm hungry or when I have to go to the bathroom. I also find myself having a lot more meltdowns and shutdowns than what is typical for me. I'm exhausted more easily, but then do an absolutely terrible job at sleeping because my brain can't settle because it feels wonky. Often taking forever to fall asleep or waking up at odd hours or oversleeping. Like all of those things kind of happen at the same time. The last characteristic thing for me is that my ability to focus goes out the window. I become really sluggish and spacey and my working memory gets really terrible. I forget everything. It's a problem. I genuinely wanted to make a video for that week, but the concept of even starting to research something made me want to cry. And when I tried to open a new Google Doc to start an outline, I kept getting horribly distracted by literally nothing. I would stare at the wall for like an hour, or I would just forget what I was meant to be doing. Completely. Also, I think this is implied, but in case it's not implied, you don't have to experience all of these things to be burnt out, and burnout is not exclusively all of these things. These are just the things off the top of my head in this moment. If there's anything that you experienced that I didn't name, you're super welcome to share it in the comment section. Obviously, long-term, none of this is ideal. It gets in the way of being able to live day to day, but it also has long-term impacts. I know like my most major issue that comes out of burnout is that I will often start eating things that I am allergic to because it's the only thing I can force myself to eat, and I just assume that eating something that isn't good for me is better than eating nothing at all, which is the case the first time, maybe the second time, but once it becomes a frequent habit, or like every day, every other day, it starts to cause damage to my body. Shocking, I know. Which you would think is obvious, but the amount of self-control that it took, especially when I had a dining hall as a student, to try to avoid the things that looked yummy and eat the things that would not make me sick but were distinctly not yummy, is something I very rarely possessed when I was burnt out. It is a lot easier now that I'm like living on my own because I have to go to the store to buy the food that finds its way into the apartment. It's a lot easier to avoid foods I'm allergic to in the store than when I'm in my apartment feeling snacky. But either way, in case you didn't know, eating a lot of things that your body can't handle does not make your body happy long term and can cause real damage. On top of that, I have found for both myself and many friends of mine that when burnout hits and I keep pushing through it anyway without taking any precautions to help work on coping or resting or taking care of myself, my body takes matters into its own hands and it does whatever it possibly can to stop it in its tracks. This is when my worst IBS flare-ups happen, it's when my worst migraines happen, and usually those are the ones that get to a degree where I'm genuinely concerned for my longevity as a person and have done serious long-term damage. There isn't a whole ton of research into the long-term impacts of burnout, but just colloquially within community conversations, most people find that autistic burnout links them to struggling more with both physical and mental illness, some of which is irreversible. So like in my case with my IBS, I suddenly became intolerant to a gazillion food situation. To be fair, other medical stuff was going on during that situation where that happened, so it's kind of hard to pinpoint what specifically happened, but also like most people who have major burnouts can't really pinpoint but specifically what's happening either, so who knows? I also do know other folks who have had serious IBS issues arise from severe burnout, so I think I'm quite sure that it is at least half of that. Now, most studies that I could track down on autistic burnout talk more about the depression aspects of it, specifically how many folks experiencing burnout report increased depression and ideation. Fill in the blank, I'll let you do that. In general, autistics are 6 times more likely to attempt than the general population, but that is not necessarily burnout specific. But I will say that when I experience burnout, I found that ideation gets a lot worse because I am literally too exhausted to solve any problem, so giving up seems like an easier option for my brain to come up with, which is really just my body saying, it's time to take a pause from life, to rest, to reset, and then the solutions will come and things will get better. It just doesn't feel that way because I'm too tired to think clearly. And the thing that's tricky is that autistic burnout and a battle with clinical depression often present almost identically, but the treatments are more or less the exact opposite of each other. I found for me, knowing that is actually really helpful because I always felt like depression was something that just appeared one day and I couldn't do anything about it, and then one day disappeared and I just had to like wait for it to go away, and that was the worst part because it made me most hopeless because I felt helpless, but realizing that instead I'm probably experiencing burnout and my brain is telling me that it doesn't feel like anything matters and everything sucks because it's just too exhausted to care about or appreciate those things, and that will probably go away once I take better care of myself and give myself some time and some space. That gives me an action and a goal and makes it feel less like an endless slog because I have some semblance of control over it. Not necessarily of when the feeling goes away, but I know that like I can take steps to slowly make it go away, which we'll talk about in a moment. But obviously those center around different kinds of rest. When it comes to depression, the typical treatment involves trying to force yourself to get up every day and do the things that you need to do. Staying in bed all day, doing nothing is going to make it worse. You shouldn't do that. And also, if you're autistic and you're suddenly losing skills, the instinct is to start doing more therapy to try to work to regain those skills, all of which focus on getting up and pushing yourself further. But if it's a case of burnout, where your body and your brain is screaming, stop, please stop, that may make things worse rather than better. So it's kind of tricky and it's hard because everything looks really similar and it's hard to know what will and what won't actually help. So here's what I do. The first is something that I talk about a lot on this channel. It's how I figured out how to get by in general as a chronically ill person. I will link my video about it up here for you, which is economizing energy. This is something that you should definitely do while burnt out, but also take the time to do in your regular life, disabled or not, frankly. Economizing energy, everybody could benefit from it, because really, all of life is a balancing act between burnout and not burnt out. Economizing energy, to put it simply, is figuring out how to make it look like you're giving 110% all the time when you're actually only ever taking up about 60 to 70% of your energy, which means that if you have to drop to 40%, people are a lot less likely to notice. It also means that you can sustainably function every single day, and it generally makes one better at things that they do because they figured out how to do them more efficiently, so it like actually makes you better at your craft. Truly, if you leave this video or even this channel with only one piece of advice, it is to learn to economize your energy. It takes time to sort out what works for you because it looks super different for everybody, but paying attention to how many energy bars or spoons or whatever metaphor you want to use that you put into each task and then trying to figure out how you can cut that by like 30% is a really fun and rewarding game. They'll make living life as a human so much easier. Highly recommend. This may be bad advice, but when I'm feeling particularly exhausted or burnt out, I often use that time to try out new methods of economizing energy in very short bursts. For example, like I found that I get really exhausted when I do one aspect of voice training. So while exhausted and hypersensitive, I decided to give it a go for like a quarter to a third of the time I normally do it. Turns out I was holding a lot of tension in my jaw that I only noticed now because everything starts hurting faster because I'm hypersensitive. I was able to teach myself how to not hold that tension. I've also been trying to learn how to sing more lazily and still sound the way that I want to, and it's making me a better singer. It's making me better at my craft. It's great. Working a lot, especially on exhausting things while burnt out, not a great idea. Don't do it. But if you want like to do a teeny tiny bit of something that you normally do that is motivating you and sparking your interest and brings you joy, this is actually a really great time to play with that and see what you can learn. Like within limits, pay attention to yourself, but I like using this time to learn things. So there is that. The other thing kind of tying into that I do when I'm burnt out is I pause my to-do list. I triage it. Whatever needs to get done right now is going to get done right now. And then what can wait for like a week or so for me to recover, that will get tabled for later. And then I pull out the fun list. I don't know if you keep a fun list, you should. It's all the tasks that I want to complete, like, I don't know, reorganizing my computer desktop or watching this random movie, but they never end up on my short day-to-day list because they don't have any deadline, and also they don't really matter. I really like feeling like I have a purpose and am focused on something that I'm doing even when I do not have the energy to actually be able to focus on something or do something that takes a lot of brain power, so I end up starting to tackle the fun list. I talked a little bit about this in my last video, but I like cleaned my computer, I sorted out my entire camera roll, I made new playlists, I sat on the bathroom floor and I reorganized the drawer cabinet on the bottom thing because moving shapes around so they fit better is fun. And yeah, I felt like I was doing something that was important and it was fun and it passed the time, but it also took little to no focus or brain power. So it felt like a brain vacation for what I normally do. So it did still feel restful. If something motivates me, I follow it like a toddler chasing a butterfly. I let that guide me for a week or two if I can swing it. And that is the most rejuvenating possible thing for me. In regards to actual like survival mode aspects of burnout, I highly recommend fully parenting yourself. Like earlier where I said that I have a no social media posting rule when I hit a certain point where my brain feels weird, I often set up parental controls on my phone for myself to help me regulate a bit, so I'll stop scrolling and stuff like that. I will set up arbitrary rules that I then feel overly compelled to follow because I am so tired that any structure is welcome and I start getting anxious about breaking rules, or I deliberately put up literal barriers in my way that I am just too tired to figure out how to get around. The stuff on the day-to-day is not typically super effective for me, but for burnt out sleepy Sydney, it works perfectly and it's great. I just treat myself like a toddler and it's effective. It's wonderful. The other thing that I guess sort of ties into economizing energy is that a lot of autistic burnout is caused more specifically by having to mask too much without proper time to relax and unmask and reset. So trying to figure out ways to safely unmask in your day-to-day life is really important. And I acknowledge that this is a somewhat privileged thing and that like I can stim on the subway and get ignored while a black man doing the same thing would be risking his life. But finding places where you're masking and don't really need to be is a great start. Like for example, in my apartment, I have completely stopped masking and my roommate doesn't care because she's great. So like, it's fine. But that has saved me a lot of energy. I have a very old video on masking and unmasking. I don't know how much it holds up. I'm gonna be real about it, but I will link it above as a resource. But a lot of learning to unmask is just learning to find ways to accommodate yourself in public settings and in your own space and make things accessible and feel safe to you. For me, I lip read people rather than making eye contact, which helps my access needs in two directions, but I'm still looking at people's faces so they think it's not rude. That's really a great, trick that I have. I wear headphones in the grocery store, so I get less overwhelmed. I don't wear things, no matter how pretty they may be, that are sensory nightmares for me. You may notice I've dressed less vintage lately than I usually do. A lot of vintage clothes are not soft. I'm still trying to figure that one out because I kind of miss it. But these are very little things that I can do that help make the world a little bit easier for me to manage. So find those things and try to use them and change them where you possibly can. The last thing I want to talk about in regards to burnout care is the 7 types of rest. I learned about this via a wonderful post by @neuro_divers on Instagram. They're a wonderful account. You should go follow them. I will primarily be going off of their wonderful post on the topic because it was really great. This concept was created by Dr. Sandra Dalton Smith, hopefully I pronounced that right, which she published in her 2017 book. She probably spoke about it beforehand. I'm sure it's in some scientific paper beforehand. I couldn't track that down, but I'm quite sure this concept exists via her somewhere else and also probably in general elsewhere as well, just some different wording. But basically, the idea is that there are 7 different kinds of resting that fulfill different needs. And if you're only focusing on one kind of rest, you may feel exhausted and fatigued still because that may not be the need that you're actually having. So the first is physical rest. This includes things like sleeping, getting a massage, going on a walk, stimming, daily stretches, or small workouts, generally things that refresh the body. Mental rest is things like taking brain breaks, following routines, meditating, giving yourself external reminders of things so you don't have to hold a million things in your brain at once, and deliberately trying to focus on less things in one go, generally just like taking care of your brain. Sensory rest is things like dim lights, comfy clothes, doing self-check-ins, using the feel wheel or another emotional naming tool, using noise-canceling headphones, listening to your favorite music, etc. Creative rest is doing things that you want to rather than things that you have to do, doing a craft, physically making something, engaging in hobbies. Emotional rest is not judging yourself for feelings, not comparing yourself to others, having alone time, journaling, talking to a close friend, learning to unmask. Social rest is engaging with people that you feel safe around, which can be in person or texting or just sending Instagram reels back and forth with your best friend, or even just sitting in the same space with somebody while you both do different things and don't talk to each other. That's also connecting with a person. And then the last one is spiritual rest, which is connecting with community, engaging in prayer, engaging in things that give you a sense of belonging, and doing nostalgic or cozy, homey things. These kinds of rest may not resonate with you, they may resonate with you. Either way, hopefully they're, some tools that can be helpful. I feel like a lot of the things my body knew but my brain didn't, if that makes any sense. Like hearing words put to it has helped me to be more deliberate about trying to engage in all kinds of rest. But overall, I know the post-holiday season is rough on everybody. I know that most of my friends are struggling with burnout right now, so I hope this was somewhat helpful. Burnout is not something that you can suddenly fix in one day. It usually takes at minimum a week, usually several weeks. I have had burnouts bad enough that it's taken me months to slowly work myself out of them, so don't be frustrated if you're not better immediately, because that's not going to happen. That's not how this kind of stuff works. And honestly, I've learned the most about how to take care of myself during burnout. I've learned a lot about what my values are and where I want to spend my minimal energy, and it becomes a lot easier afterward to economize energy and take care of yourself. Not that terrible things don't need to have a silver lining because they don't. They can just suck, and they do suck. But I also know that I usually come out of burnout with a slightly larger toolkit on how to be a human and how to survive. So I hope that if this is how you're feeling, like, you know that you'll probably come out with that at the other side. You'll survive this. Pace yourself. All of life is pacing oneself, and it's really hard, especially in a world that is super inaccessible and deliberately built to force people to not pace themselves. But what I'm trying to say is hang in there, because you're doing great. This too shall pass. It always does. You know, all the cheesy stuff. Anyway, as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it is never too late to start over. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.